At sunrise, the Pantanal breathes. Mist rises slowly from the flooded plains of South America's largest tropical wetland. Water reflects the pale gold of the morning sky, broken only by the silhouettes of scattered trees and the quiet ripples of fish beneath the surface. Birds begin first. Scarlet macaws cross the horizon in pairs. Jabiru storks wade through the shallows. Capybaras gather along the muddy banks, their bodies half submerged in still water. For thousands of years, this landscape has operated like a living machine, a vast ecological network where every species, predator, prey, plant, insect, plays a precise role in maintaining balance. But hidden within this delicate system is a predator powerful enough to reshape the entire environment. A hunter that moves silently through water, forest, and grassland. The jaguar. In the Pantanal, jaguars are not just predators. They are regulators of life itself. Adult males can weigh over 100 kilograms, equipped with the strongest bite force of any big cat relative to body size. Their jaws can pierce turtle shells and crush the skulls of caimans. But their greatest influence is not simply what they hunt. It is how their presence reshapes the behavior of everything else. For centuries, jaguars ruled the Pantanal's flooded forests and open marshes. And for just as long, the ecosystem thrived under their watch. But by the late 20th century, something began to change. Across large areas of the Pantanal, jaguars started to disappear. The cause was not disease, nor was it natural migration. It was human expansion. As cattle ranching expanded across Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, the Pantanal's predators were increasingly seen as threats. Ranchers who lost calves to jaguar attacks often retaliated. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, hunting pressure on jaguars intensified. In some regions, bounty systems even rewarded hunters for killing them. By the early 1990s, jaguar numbers across large parts of the Pantanal had dropped sharply. And with them, something else began to shift. At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible. Scientists studying the region noticed growing populations of capybaras, the world's largest rodent. Capybaras are semi-aquatic herbivores that thrive in wetlands. They feed on grasses, aquatic plants, and young shoots along riverbanks. Under normal conditions, jaguars hunt capybaras regularly. In fact, in many areas of the Pantanal, capybaras make up a significant portion of the jaguar's diet. But as jaguars vanished from certain regions, capybara populations surged. Groups that once numbered 10 or 15 individuals began expanding to 40, sometimes 60 animals. With fewer predators, survival rates increased dramatically. More young reached adulthood. More females reproduced successfully. Within just a few years, the marshlands were crowded with grazing rodents. But capybaras were not the only species responding to the disappearance of jaguars. Caiman populations, the small crocodilian reptiles that inhabit the Pantanal's waterways, also began increasing. Normally, jaguars prey heavily on caimans, especially juveniles and medium-sized individuals. Without this pressure, caiman survival improved. Shallow lagoons that once supported moderate caiman densities began filling with hundreds. At first glance, the Pantanal appeared more alive than ever. More animals, more activity, more movement across the wetlands. But ecosystems do not measure health by abundance alone. Balance is what matters. And the Pantanal's balance was beginning to tilt. Large herds of capybaras grazed aggressively along the edges of rivers and lakes. They stripped grasses faster than they could regrow. Riverbanks that were once stabilized by vegetation began eroding. Sediment washed into shallow waterways. Aquatic plants declined in some regions. At the same time, dense concentrations of caimans competed more intensely for fish and amphibians. Local fish populations began shifting in response. Certain species declined, while others expanded rapidly. Predator-prey relationships that had once remained stable for centuries were now fluctuating. For many years, these changes went largely unnoticed outside the scientific community. To visitors and tourists, the Pantanal still appeared vibrant and wild. But researchers studying long-term ecological patterns began to recognize something deeper. The disappearance of a single predator had triggered a cascade, a chain reaction rippling through the entire ecosystem. In ecological science, this process has a name: a trophic cascade. When a top predator disappears, species below it expand unchecked. Those species then alter the abundance of plants, animals, and even physical landscapes. Sometimes the effects are subtle. Other times, they reshape entire environments. By the early 2000s, several ecological monitoring projects across the Pantanal began compiling long-term wildlife data. Camera traps, satellite tracking, population surveys. The results revealed a pattern that scientists could no longer ignore. Regions with fewer jaguars consistently showed higher capybara densities, higher caiman concentrations, more vegetation damage along riverbanks, and increasingly unstable food webs. The system was shifting. But reversing such a change would not be simple. Predators cannot simply be placed back into a landscape and expected to restore balance overnight. Large carnivores require vast territories. Male jaguars alone may roam across 100 square kilometers. They also face serious threats from human conflict. Reintroducing them into ranching regions could trigger the same retaliatory killings that caused their decline in the first place. For years, scientists debated whether intervention was even possible. Could jaguars safely return to the Pantanal? Would ranchers accept their presence? And perhaps most importantly, would restoring a predator population actually repair the ecosystem? These questions remained unanswered until an ambitious conservation initiative began taking shape. One that would attempt something rarely tested at such scale. Instead of protecting only the remaining jaguars, scientists proposed to actively rebuild the predator population. 80 jaguars, carefully relocated and reintroduced across key regions of the Pantanal Wetlands. The plan was bold, risky, and unlike most conservation projects, it came with a long-term commitment. Because the real answer wouldn't appear in the first year, or even the second. The true test would take time. A decade of ecological observation. 10 years to see whether the return of a predator could truly restore balance to one of the world's most complex wetlands. But what scientists discovered during those 10 years would reveal just how powerful a single species can be, and how deeply its absence had reshaped the Pantanal. The first jaguar stepped out of the transport crate just before dusk. For a moment, the forest remained completely silent. The cat paused at the edge of the clearing, muscles tense, golden coat blending almost perfectly with the dry grasses of the Pantanal's floodplain. Its eyes scanned the unfamiliar landscape, a mixture of shallow wetlands, forest islands, and winding rivers stretching toward the horizon. Then, with slow confidence, it disappeared into the vegetation. It was the first of 80. Over the following months, conservation teams carefully relocated jaguars from regions where populations were stable into carefully selected areas of the Pantanal where predators had largely vanished. Each animal carried a GPS collar. Each movement would be tracked. Each hunt, territory, and interaction would become part of a decade-long ecological experiment. But returning a predator to an ecosystem is not simply about numbers. A predator's influence extends far beyond the animals it kills. Its presence alters behavior, movement, fear, across entire landscapes. Ecologists refer to this as the landscape of fear. When predators are present, prey animals constantly evaluate risk. They avoid certain areas. They move more frequently. They spend less time feeding in exposed locations. And those subtle changes ripple outward through the environment. In the Pantanal, scientists suspected this behavioral shift might be just as important as the jaguar's direct predation. Within weeks of the first releases, the GPS collars began transmitting data. The jaguars moved quickly. Some traveled more than 20 kilometers in a single night. Others established territories along rivers, where prey was abundant. But the most important information came from camera traps scattered throughout the wetlands. Thousands of automated cameras watched riverbanks, trails, and marsh edges day and night. And within 3 months, the first changes began to appear. Capybara groups were shrinking, not because the jaguars were hunting them constantly, but because their behavior had changed. Before the reintroduction, large herds often gathered in open areas for hours, grazing without interruption. Now those same areas showed a different pattern. Capybaras fed quickly, then retreated into thicker vegetation. Some abandoned certain riverbanks entirely. The mere presence of jaguars had altered their routines, and this shift carried surprising ecological consequences. When capybaras graze intensively along riverbanks, they remove vegetation that stabilizes soil. Without roots to hold the earth together, erosion increases. Sediment washes into the water. Over time, this can cloud waterways and disrupt aquatic ecosystems. But when capybaras feed cautiously and move frequently, vegetation has time to recover. Within the first year, researchers documented subtle but measurable regrowth of grasses and shrubs along several river corridors. The plants had not been replanted. They had simply been given a chance to survive. Meanwhile, another dramatic shift was unfolding beneath the water surface. Caimans. The Pantanal is home to millions of these crocodilian reptiles. Under normal conditions, they share the waterways with jaguars in a complex predator-prey relationship. Jaguars hunt caimans regularly, especially smaller individuals. But during the decades when jaguar numbers declined, caiman populations had expanded significantly. In some lagoons, densities reached nearly 200 caimans per hectare. Such concentrations placed heavy pressure on fish populations. Small fish species became increasingly scarce in certain areas. And where fish declined, birds that depended on them also struggled. The return of jaguars began to reshape this balance. Camera footage soon captured something scientists had hoped to observe: a jaguar hunting caiman along a muddy riverbank. With a powerful bite behind the skull, a precise technique jaguars used to kill armored prey, the predator dragged the reptile into nearby vegetation. Over the next 2 years, similar scenes repeated across the monitored regions. Jaguars were not eliminating caimans entirely, but they were selectively removing individuals, especially medium-sized caimans that competed heavily for fish. This created an unexpected ecological release. Fish populations in several study lagoons began recovering. Species that had become rare, including small characins and juvenile catfish, started appearing more frequently in net surveys. With more fish available, birds followed. Herons, kingfishers, black skimmers. Each species responded to the shifting food supply. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery involved something far less visible: nutrients. When a jaguar kills prey, whether capybara, deer, or caiman, the carcass rarely remains untouched. Scavengers quickly arrive. Vultures circle overhead. Crab-eating foxes approach cautiously. Even insects begin consuming the remains within hours. The carcass becomes a temporary hub of biological activity, a nutrient hotspot. Nitrogen and phosphorus from decomposing tissue seep into the soil. Plants nearby grow richer and taller. These localized nutrient pulses can influence vegetation patterns over time. Before jaguars returned, such events were rare in the monitored areas. But as the predator population stabilized, carcasses began appearing across the landscape, each one feeding dozens of other organisms, each one redistributing energy through the ecosystem. Yet despite these early changes, the system had not fully stabilized. Because predators do not operate in isolation, their effects accumulate gradually. Some species respond quickly, others take years to adjust. And by the 3rd year of monitoring, scientists noticed something both surprising and slightly unsettling. While capybara numbers had declined in some areas, in others they had moved. Large groups were shifting toward regions where jaguars were still scarce. There, the familiar pattern returned: heavy grazing, riverbank erosion, localized overpopulation. The jaguars were shaping behavior, but their territories covered only portions of the Pantanal. The experiment was still incomplete. Meanwhile, the jaguars themselves were adapting. Some individuals expanded their ranges. Others produced cubs. By year 4, the first generation born within the restored ecosystem began exploring their own territories. This was a critical milestone because a self-sustaining predator population behaves differently than a managed one. Young jaguars disperse. They compete. They explore new hunting grounds. And as they spread across the wetlands, their influence travels with them. But this expansion also raised new questions. Would jaguars eventually reclaim enough territory to restore balance across the entire region? Or would human pressures limit their recovery? And perhaps more importantly, would the ecosystem respond fast enough? Because by year 5, new data from